Across Europe, crippling heat is tightening its grip, with huge areas of land on fire and water resources running dangerously low. Half of England is now in official drought, with 40 plus days without rain in some parts. My garden looks like this. And the UK has just had its fourth heatwave of the year. But don't worry, Europeans, you're about to get your fourth too. Europe is about to have its fourth, possibly record-breaking heatwave of the year as high pressure sets in once more and we see a return of that famous heat dome. And everything's on fire as a result. We've already seen really devastating wildfires in France and Spain in particular, but they've also been present in Scotland, in England, Wales, Portugal, Greece, and across the Balkans actually. And across the entirety of Europe, we've seen around 25% higher area burned than in 2025. And 2025 was previously the worst European fire season on record. And this year's fire burned area, and remember it's not even August yet, as I'm recording this, we've got about 12 hours to go until August. This year is already 2.5 times higher than the long-term average. The long-term average is 172,000 odd hectares burned per year. In 2025, there was about 350,000 hectares burned. And by the 29th of July, that's the latest statistics, we were on 435 hectares burned. So that's a real big increase. I mean, I'm sure it will end up being quite a lot larger by the end of the summer. And in fact, you can see in this map from Copernicus, Europe's climate change monitoring service, that there are huge swathes of Europe that are this really dark, kind of red, almost black colour, which indicates very extreme fire danger. And that's a combination of a bunch of things, including drought and temperature and humidity and wind that I'm going to get into later. But you can see that vast amounts of England and Wales, as well as France and Spain, but also stretching into central and more eastern parts of Europe and the Balkans, have this really high fire risk for the end of July and the beginning of August. Pretty scary stuff. It means that fires are not just able to be started, but they're also reasonably likely to start. Already we've seen 3 firefighters dying in Greece from fighting separate fires. We saw 300,000 plus people evacuated from their homes across southern France and Spain, including nearly 200,000 in the Gironde region, which is near Bordeaux. And there were some pretty scary videos from those fires, and I'm sure you've seen some in the news, but just gonna throw some on your screen now. And part of the reason that these fires have been so bad is because this year has seen kind of flip-flopping between relatively wet conditions and then very dry conditions. And that's, a symptom of climate change. We get this unpredictable, variable rainfall. And what that means is when it's wet, you get lots of vegetation growing. And then when it's really dry, it dries out, essentially. And then that can be fuel to burn. So that's when you get these really devastating wildfires that go through huge amounts of land. We also saw the hottest June on record in Western Europe, and this is partly consistent with the developing Super El Nino, but as we know, it's still early days for that. But it's also tied to climate change, of course. We saw extreme heat in June, we saw extreme drought in June, and those conditions combined were made 80 times more likely by climate heating. So climate heating is creating the conditions for fires to pop up much more often. And it means that lots of people, entire families, entire communities, pets, people, everyone are all being forced to stay temporarily in emergency shelters that are being set up. It means that people are losing their livelihoods. Certain parts of Spain and France, this is wine region. The wine harvest has been completely destroyed. People's crops, people's farms, people's homes, people's vehicles, their entire livelihoods are just gone in the blink of an eye. We also saw in Scotland, in Aviemore, which is beautiful kind of open area of Scotland, in the Cairngorms, there was a fire that burned for 2 weeks from the middle of July. And because it's this really open area of land, the land could really burn very quickly. And this is a place that has nature reserves. This is a place that has bird habitats that have been completely devastated. And speaking of fires that keep going on for ages, there's also another fire in Suffolk in England, in eastern England, a very dry part of the country in normal conditions, let alone at the moment. And this is again on a heathland, so it's once again one of these regions that's harder to contain a fire, and also contains nature reserves and, worryingly perhaps, a nearby nuclear power plant. Apparently they're on high alert, but at the moment there's no particular danger. And as I'm recording this, on the 31st of July, the fire is still going. So this is the third day that fire has been going on. Now, all of these fires, the ones that we're seeing across France, the ones we're seeing across Spain, across Portugal, across the Balkans, across the UK, all of these are made more likely and made possible, in fact, because of fire weather. And fire weather is a combination of meteorological weather and hydrological, so rainfall conditions, that conspires together to make it much more possible for fires to spread and to develop once they've ignited. So the first part of this is that you have high temperatures and low humidity. So when something's very dry, it dries out all the vegetation, and that acts as a fuel, especially when you have a drought. So that kind of preconditions the landscape and dries out vegetation over the much longer term. And that's what we've been seeing in Europe for the last few months. We've had very little rainfall after the kind of wettish beginning of the year. And then that also means if you have a drought, it's less difficult. It's more difficult to actually fight the fire because you've got fewer water resources to actually end up suppressing the fire. And then also if you have wind, then it fans the flames and it allows them to spread. And this is what we saw with the LA fires, for example, at the beginning of 2025, I think it was, that you had this really strong wind, which made it really impossible to fight because it was just being blown onto more and more houses and they were catching. And that's why the LA fires were quite so devastating. Now, fire weather doesn't make fires start, but it does mean that they can become bigger and spread further and be stronger as a result if those conditions are present. And across Europe, we have had fire weather. We've had pretty prevalent fire weather. We've had higher temperatures than usual, by between 6 and 10 degrees in some places. You can see that in this map, which shows you the maximum temperature on, this is today's date, so the 31st of July, near the surface. And if we look particularly at Europe here, you can see that the maximum daily temperature is in the mid-40s in parts of northern Italy and also in the tip of southern Spain. But also it's pushing up into the high 30s, low 40s in a lot of Europe. Like that's a large area of Europe that's got very high maximum temperatures. If we look at it in a slightly different way, this is looking at how much higher it is than usual. So this is showing you the temperature anomaly, so the temperature difference compared to the average, which in this case is 1980 to 2000, basically. You can see that pretty much everywhere, apart from maybe parts of the UK and also most of Portugal are pretty about average today, but most of Europe is warmer. And if we'd looked at this for the last few weeks, we would have seen even larger temperature anomalies. So we've had warm conditions, we've also had drought conditions, so we've got prime conditions basically for all of these fires to start and to make them much bigger once they are ignited. And once fires get going, they can actually start to make their own weather, which can become self-sustaining. So there's a type of cloud that can be created when wildfires start called a pyrocumulonimbus. So you might have heard the word cumulonimbus before. It's just a thunderstorm cloud, like these really big towering thunderstorm clouds that you get in the summer. But a pyrocumulonimbus is one initiated or created by a fire. That smoke plume contains a lot of particulate matter, so these little soot particles that go up into the atmosphere in a plume, and these act as little seeds basically onto which the water vapor that's in the atmosphere can condense onto. And that creates water droplets that then high up in the atmosphere produces a cloud. And you can see that in this lovely diagram from the UK's Met Office, how there's this big fire, big plume goes up into the atmosphere, and at a certain level where the atmosphere cools down enough, you get a cloud forming because of all the particulates. And then that cloud can become really big and it can develop a really large vertical scale, and then that starts to create its own up and down motion, and then you can get what they call a downdraft, and the downdraft can fan the flames even more, and that makes it spread, it makes it even bigger, it kind of adds fuel to the fire, if you like. And once you get really big clouds like this, that's when you start to see lightning, and lightning can ignite more fires. And because of the fire weather that's been going on, the conditions are dry, there's ample vegetation, it's hot enough that lightning can trigger more fires. And this can be really devastating because these clouds can get really big. They can be like 10, 15 kilometers scale. And they can trigger more fires, even several kilometers downwind. And then it becomes really hard to kind of chase the advancing front of fire. And this is what we saw in France and Spain. So there's multiple pictures in the news of fire clouds, these pyrocumulonimbus, and they're huge. You can see them, the scale of them, with like this helicopter against the scale of the massive cloud plume. It doesn't even look that big in that one, but some of these others, they're just absolutely enormous. You can see them from satellite images as well. Yeah, they're covering enormous areas and creating more fire, essentially. Now, the wildfires are abating now in France and Spain as I'm recording this, but unfortunately, the next heat wave is just around the corner, because temperatures are expected to be much higher than usual across much of Europe as we go into August, with so-called explosive wildfire conditions, as relative humidity tumbles back to around 20%. So this is pretty dry conditions across Central Europe. And the forecast for the 1st of August, I'll show you this map, shows pretty warm temperatures. Again, we're looking at the purple colours are kind of above 40 degrees Celsius. That's mostly confined to southern Spain, but we're seeing high 30s, mid to high 30s across much of Central Europe, and particularly high temperatures in the Balkans. And then if we skip ahead a couple of days to the 4th of August, you can see that the high temperatures in the Balkans and Central Europe especially start to intensify, whereas over the sort of western side, France and Spain, etc., temperatures are actually going back to something a little bit more manageable, or at least a little bit more normal. This period is probably going to have higher temperatures over the Balkans and over Central Europe, rather than where we've had it before in the last few heat waves, which has been centered over Western Europe. We can also look at it in this way, which is looking at the anomalies that are expected for next week. And this is, of course, a forecast based on the European software. And we're expecting to see much higher temperatures than usual in the Central European region and the Balkans, as I've already mentioned, and cooler temperatures across much of Northern Europe, so Scandinavia and Northern Russia. The other part of fire weather is, of course, precipitation. We're expecting to see lower precipitation across most of Central Europe, and high precipitation in that area that's meant to be going to be quite cold in comparison to usual, so northern Scandinavia especially. But most of Europe is going to see lower rain and higher temperatures, which is going to be breeding more wildfire risk. So what's this actually caused by? We're probably quite familiar with hearing this term heat dome by now. And a heat dome is when you have high pressure building, and that kind of forces air down on top of itself, and as it comes down it gets compressed, sort of like if you pump air into a bike tire and you can feel it warming up. That's the kind of principle. You've got more and more air piling on top of itself, and then it's pushing itself down, and it gets warmed as it sinks by this kind of compressive process. This is kind of like what happened in the June-July heat wave, but that one was, of course, further west, including the UK. But now this is going to be further east, so that's going to include the Balkans and Central Europe more specifically. This air is also going to be drier than last time, so this is getting like channeling air from the Sahara. It's going to get hotter, basically, in the Mediterranean and the Balkan regions because of this heat dome. And once again, this could challenge heat temperature records, and it is looking like it could sit there for quite a while. So at the moment, it looks like it might be a heat dome situation for 2 weeks or something like this. So this is something that's going to basically stay there for the first half of August. Now, the proliferation that we're expecting of all of these conditions means that there's a higher risk of wildfires further in towards the centre of Europe. And we've seen already how much wildfires can devastate people's lives. They can claim homes, they can claim lives, they can claim crops, livelihoods, but they can also present a health risk to people and a much wider area. You don't have to be caught up right in the very worst of it to be affected by wildfires. Partly that's because inhaling smoke, inhaling particulate matter, presents a real threat to your respiratory health. And in fact, about 1.5 million people per year are estimated to have their lives shortened by wildfire smoke inhalation. So the carbon monoxide, the nitrous oxides, all of the stuff that comes off of a wildfire is particularly dangerous to our lungs. It's obviously not very good for us. And of course, you're burning loads of carbon and releasing huge amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which is literally fueling the exact problem. So it's a real reinforcing cycle that we're seeing here. It's worth saying that, of course, fire weather doesn't create fires, and most wildfires are created by human activity. Arson is one tiny fraction of that, but majority is coming from carelessness. So in these kinds of conditions, it's very worth being extra careful, extra vigilant. Like discarded cigarettes are a big culprit, unquenched barbecues are a big culprit, fireworks, things like this. But also we see kind of electricity pylons, sparks from industrial activities, electrical failures in this kind of heat. They can also start fires. So as a PSA, just be careful when you're outside and just be very vigilant of the things that can start fire. Climate change is undeniably making wildfires worse. It increases the variability of rainfall. It makes it much less predictable. It increases the likelihood of drought. It primes the land for wildfire. It increases the number and severity of heat waves. It allows fire weather to develop. It makes people suffer as a result. And wildfires can then start, and when they start, they can spread much further. The firefighters are increasingly becoming a climate service on the front line of climate change, and I'm genuinely scared for next year when El Nino is even stronger, and this really isn't going away. It's really hard to ignore all of the crazy stuff going on in the news at the moment, and I think one of the best ways to fight the fear about climate change is to talk about it. So please do share these videos to start a conversation. And of course, if you want to support these videos, if you value them and you think that they're worthwhile, please do consider supporting the channel over on Patreon, and the link is over here. But if you want to hear more about how Indigenous people in the Amazon are fighting wildfires and fighting climate change in the process, then you might like this video that I made about it over here. All right, I'll catch you next time. Ciao.